This is entitled My Unique Relationship with Robert Maxwell, The Truth at Last. I don't hasten to add that it is my third book about Robert Maxwell, and it is the introduction to the book entitled My Unique Relationship with Robert Maxwell, The Truth at Last. I have written 3 books about Robert Maxwell. Unlike the first 2 books, the third book is devoid of raunchiness, vulgarity, and other literary flaws. The first book I wrote about him is entitled Robert Maxwell as I Knew Him. This book has been sold out, but it is not only appallingly written, it was written in a hurry. The reviewers were unanimous in saying that though it was extremely amusing, my literary style was dreadful. In fact, my prose is packed with cliches and contains the occasional unending verbose paragraph. Much of the writing in this book is banal, puerile, and unreadable. Robert Maxwell's widow was greatly upset by the first 2 books. The fact that Robert Maxwell as I Knew Him is flawed prompted me to write a second book about him entitled Captain Bob and Me. My favourite brother, Nicky, alas dead, egged me on a bit and dared me to write the above book in a really racy manner. I confess that I was slightly inebriated whenever I sat down to write it. Regrettably, Captain Bob and Me is saturated with sexual innuendo and even necrophile fantasies about the main protagonist. I got carried away and implied in places that my relationship with the tortured Arab East had been sexual. I deeply regret having done this, and of misleading not only my readers, but also the members of the Maxwell family. The grammar in Captain Bob and Me is faulty in a number of places, but fortunately the book is not overtly drenched in cliches, as is Robert Maxwell as I Knew Him. I am pleased to say that Captain Bob and Me has been sold out, although it had favourable reviews in The Spectator and The Times. I am deeply saddened and shamed by the perverse sexual fantasies which appeared in Captain Bob and Me. Nicky cheered me up by saying I was a literary bandit. Several months passed following the publication of that book. One morning, quite unexpectedly, I received a somewhat punitive letter from Bob's wretched widow, Betty. In her letter, she rightly stated that her husband had been a father figure in my life, and a father figure only. Although I was fiercely sexually attracted to him, no sexual relations took place between us at any time or in any place. I was and still am filled with regret for having upset Betty, who had always been a surrogate mother to me. In her letter, she stated that she had known from the first day I met her about my infatuation for her husband. Hers were strong words indeed, and were my sole motive for writing the third book about him, which is entitled My Unique Relationship with Robert Maxwell, The Truth at Last, as I said earlier. I did everything in my power to make amends. I took a bouquet of flowers to Betty's flat in London. I sat on an upright wooden chair opposite her with my head bowed in embarrassment. I'm terribly, terribly sorry, but my pen got out of control, I ventured. It did, Betty replied mildly. On the comic side, Nicky was amused by our exchange of words. He was dying, but refused to let me know he was dying. There was a long silence during my conversation with Betty. Eventually, I said, I hope with all my heart that you will think about forgiving me one day. I left her flat after I had spoken to her. Very sadly, our relationship was never quite the same after that. Also, I was in hospital at the time of her funeral service and could not attend it. I don't know whether the dead can see the living, but I have a gut feeling that Betty has witnessed the writing of my third and final book about her husband. As for Bob, I am sure he has forgiven me for my vanity and my treachery. My third book is comical in places and contains a number of humorous anecdotes at the end of the book, which I have presented as a black comedy. I specialize in black humor and have always done so. I am happy to repeat that my prose in the third book is devoid of pornographic innuendo, sexual hyperbole, and necrophile fantasies. On the 30th of May 2018, I visited Bob's grave on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, and it was an honor to do so. I laid 3 large stones on the grave to indicate that I had visited it, and with the help of the sexton, I lit 2 candles. I knew that Bob could see me doing this, and that if he had disapproved of any material in the first 2 books I had written about him, he was certainly touched by the contents of the third book and by my visit to his grave. When I was there, I felt an uplifting and wonderful presence. I spoke to him at length and thanked him for having saved my life, and also for showing me round the mirror, which he had done on the last occasion I met him. I also told him how proud I was to have been his friend. Unfortunately, I got sunstroke, which was just as well, as the sexton wanted to go home to have his lunch. I am relieved by the fact that I have finally visited Bob's grave, and am enormously grateful to my friends Charlotte Spry and D'Artagnan, whose surname I do not know. Both accompanied me to Jerusalem and made my divine mission possible. Captain Bob and Me. I have changed this title to My Unique Relationship with Robert Maxwell, The Truth at Last, because the material in Captain Bob and Me was of an offensive and controversial nature and upset Bob's widow. This should be regarded as a separate book to Robert Maxwell as I knew him. The latter book is out of print, blasted. Captain Bob and Me has been appreciated by a hell of a lot of readers. It is a witty and often startling account of my 23-year-old friendship with the late mirror magnate, including my brief theory about the reason behind his unexpected death. To save time, my theory is that on one of his many excursions to the back of his yacht, the Lady Guylaine, to watch the wash in the small hours of the morning, he had a massive heart attack. It is also very possible that he died of a broken heart. He had this secretary on the mirror by whom he was absolutely besotted. Her name was Andrea Martin, and she got married to a journalist on the mirror called Nick Davis, and Bob constantly tried to talk to Andrea, his lady love, and say, "You really do not want to have anything to do with that dreadful man," masculine jealousy, with that dreadful man who's already had several divorces. Anyway, Andrea Martin finally married Nick Davis, and Bob was absolutely heartbroken, and I think his condition of being broken-hearted was to last until the end of his life. Just for comic relief, I met Andrea Martin, and I found her very bossy and very officious. She said to me, "You had a cigarette in Mr. Maxwell's laboratory. Mr. Maxwell knows you had a cigarette in his laboratory." Bob did not mention this matter to me. That was what was so nice about him. Another thing, Betty, Bob's widow, that is, complained to me profusely about Andrea Martin, and I said, funnily enough, I also had a lot of trouble with that woman, and Betty said that Andrea Martin had completely messed up the filing system on the Daily Mirror, and Betty had found it absolutely impossible to find her way around because of the disorder of the filing system. So both Betty and I formed an alliance against Andrea Martin. It is known that Bob was overweight. In the book, I account for many meetings and much hospitality from Bob and his wife, Betty, over the years, ever since I was introduced to him at a lavish birthday party at his home, Headington Hill Hall in Oxford. This was in 1968. After that, I regularly spent weekends with the Maxwells, Bob, Betty, and whatever children were in the house. I worked for him, i.e. for the Labour Party, although I took the train to London on polling day. Once in London, I voted Tory. I then took the return train to Milton Keynes and drove Labour Party supporters to the polls in my late brother Adrian's car, much to his displeasure. I have told many anecdotes, both personal and private. Bob played an earth-shatteringly large role in my life from my teens until shortly before he died. He even rescued me from a hospital which was doing me serious harm. I was given ECT, which was totally inappropriate and which could have caused me permanent brain damage. Bob stormed into the operating theatre and said, "Turn that fucking machine off." And he uttered more somewhat fruity language. He carried me out of the operating theatre like a babe in arms, as if I had been one of his children. The experience gave me a great thrill. Ribald black humour reigns throughout this book, and I hope I have provided insight into a larger-than-life interpretation of such a controversial man. Now we come to the story blurbs on the back of the book, and there are a few comments about my books, but not all my books. One book is entitled "Stop the Car, Mr. Beckett," formerly "The Rendon Boy to the Grave is Gone," and the reviewer has said makes for passionate and fascinating reading, as strange and as entertaining as all the books which came out before it. That is Dana Evans of the Bristol Evening Post. Another book quoted on the back cover, "Never Alone with Rex Malone." This is a black comedy about Robert Maxwell's relationship with a sex-crazed and thuggish funeral director. And unfortunately, it is out of print. Open quotes, "A ribald, ambitious black comedy, a story which is courageously and powerfully told." Stuart Stephen, The Daily Mail. Open quotes, "I was absolutely flabbergasted when I read it!" Exclamation mark, close quotes, Robert Maxwell. Bob was tempted to make this remark because There is a character in this book called Rex Malone who is based on him and who slings a dead body over his shoulder to give him the chance to sign his autograph for a brownie. Also, my father, Michael, was very, very jealous indeed of my admiration for Robert Maxwell, and throughout that part of my life I was pulled in different directions by two very jealous newspaper proprietors, one of a left-wing newspaper, the other of a conservative newspaper. Also, when I asked my father if he'd kindly read the manuscript of Never Alone with Rex Malone, my father agreed to do so, and he said, "You've had built a bloody great gold effigy of the man, as if he was Christ." And then he said, "Are you in love with him?" And at a later time during the conversation, he said, "You admire this man," and went on to complain about the book. And also, my father resented the fact that he too was in the book, but not for a very long time. And I called my father Selwyn Klein. And for some reason, I don't know what reason, my father particularly resented the fact that I had called him Selwyn Klein. Bob, too, was very jealous of my father. It was just a matter of very attractive male jealousy. And he was very jealous of my father, and he used to say almost pathetically, "What does Michael think of me?" And then he also said, "Do you think Michael likes me? How many weekends of the year do you spend with Michael?" he added. "And does Michael resent our relationship?" And I said, "There's nothing to resent." "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, if your father were to take such an interest in Isabel, I would go straight round to his house and I would do something about it." My father, in turn, asked me on several occasions, "Has Robert Maxwell ever made a pass at you? ? Has he ever invited you to share his bed? ? Close quotes. "Absolutely not, Daddy," I replied. Now we come to some anecdotes. The first anecdote goes this way. Ever since Bob rescued me from a loony bin in 1969, I decided I would pay him back for his kindness. I decided to write a novel in which he appeared as the main character, a character whom I idolized. Bob spoke to someone once and said, "Eleanor loves me very much because I saved her life." I started writing straight away, but had to destroy all my manuscripts. Finally, I completed the book in 1985. The book's title was Never Alone with Rex Malone. The story is a fantasy story, and in it, all the way through, was coverage of Robert Maxwell's relationship with a highly sexed, utterly thuggish funeral director. Apart from idolizing Bob, I intended to show the difference between good and evil. I put a lot of necrophilia into the book. Then came the crisis. The time had come for me to send the manuscript to Bob. Instead, I sent it round to his son, Ian, who is a great friend of mine, and asked him if he could hand it over to Bob, whom he was spending the weekend with. Will he allow me to publish? Will he refuse to let me publish? For the following week, before I was due to spend the weekend at Headington Hill Hall, I could not eat and I barely slept. I got into my silver Ford Escort and drove down the M40 at speeds of 110 miles an hour. Before I reached Headington Hill Hall, I stopped off at a pub and ordered a large gin and tonic, irrespective of the drink driving laws. I left the pub and stampeded through Headington until I reached Headington Hill Hall. I was even more terrified that Bob would refuse me permission for me to publish Never Alone with Rex Malone. Bob employed an absolutely half-witted butler whom he addressed in irony as Genius. I had had quite a lot to drink, and I could feel myself slurring my words a little. Genius opened the front door and said, "Mr. Maxwell will see you on the lawn," whereupon I completely lost my head. I did not wish to be lectured in a hostile manner by Bob about pornography and necrophilia. I panicked and rushed upstairs and immersed myself in a freezing cold bath. I heard Bob speaking out of the window in his wonderfully deep voice. "Where is Eleanor Berry, Genius?" I just managed to hear Genius saying she went upstairs to have a bath. The next word I heard was, "Why?" uttered in an even deeper voice than before. I got out of the bath, got dressed, put some makeup on, and hurried downstairs onto the lawn where Bob was waiting for me. The rather untidy manuscript lay open on his knee. He continued to smoke a cigar. I approached him from behind, and I put my hand on his shoulder. He always allowed me to do this. "Hello, Bob," I ventured. He turned towards me, still chewing his unlit cigar. "Hello, Eleanor," he replied. "There's something I must ask you, Bob." "Which is what, sweetie?" "Well, the book which I asked Ian to show you. Have you read it yet?" "Yes, Eleanor." "I'm referring to the book called Never Alone with Rex Malone. You will have no doubt gathered by now that the character Rex Malone is based entirely on you." Bob suddenly roared with laughter. "Then I take it you are enjoying it," I said. "Do I have your permission to get it published?" "If you want to know my reaction to your book, I was absolutely flabbergasted by it," exclaimed Bob. "Why were you flabbergasted?" I asked nervously. "Because you made me a sort of central figure surrounded by gravediggers, crooked funeral directors, necrophiliacs, and God knows what else. Your book is totally perverse, but you said some very nice things about me. Who's publishing it?" "Weidenfeld," I said. Ian happened to be walking past Bob and me. He was about to dive into the swimming pool. He had a really colourful bathing suit on. "Well done," he called out. "You can't go wrong with George." Incidentally, George Weidenfeld was about the most crooked publisher in London. I came into Bob's office one morning during one of the campaigns on which I was working for him. He had a man in there with him. I knew who the man was, but I didn't speak to him because I didn't like the look of him. He was unattractive and chinless. I'll hand it to him that this was not his fault, however. Bob pointed at him a bit disrespectfully and said, "Do you know who this man is?" "I haven't the faintest idea who he is," I replied, my voice raised. "Does he work in your garden?" Bob laughed and turned to the man once more. "She doesn't mean to be offensive. She's just a bit shy." The man was irritated and spoke with a heavy Yorkshire accent. Shy, bloody abrupt, I'd say." It was Arthur Scargill. We come to the second anecdote. During one of the election campaigns, when I was working for Bob, everyone moved into a place called the Wharf House, which overlooked a stagnant canal, and it was near the Labour Party's headquarters. I was not all that industrious and spent the mornings in bed sleeping. Occasionally I was stirred by the sound of vigilant campaigners calling "Vote while you can, Maxwell's your man" over loud hailers. The Maxwells had an Irish cleaning woman. I think her name was Mrs. Mock. I was unaware at the time that Bob spent a lot of the mornings in Wharf House. One morning I was rumbled. From 8 o'clock in the morning onwards, I was woken at 15-minute intervals by Mrs. Mock's shrill Irish accent. "Mr. Maxwell says it's high time you were hopping out of your bed. He thinks you've been there quite long enough." I ignored her visits. At 12:30, the great man himself rattled into the bedroom. He came up to me and sat on his haunches like a policeman asking a motorist whether he had been drinking. He leant forward, his face less than a foot away from mine. I was struck by the extreme sweetness of his breath. He pointed first at me, then at the ceiling. For some reason, I suddenly thought of the film A Clockwork Orange, which I had recently seen. I quoted a line from it: "Leave us be, and I'll be right as Dodgers for this after." Bob appeared irritated. "You up," he shouted. After that, he made me sleep on a camp bed in his study. Early in the morning, I used to watch him working at his desk without his knowledge. He was sitting in profile, with his tie loosened at the neck. This was something which set my blood on fire. I loved to lie on the camp bed looking at him, and the thing which excited me most was the fact that he had no idea he was being watched. The experience was similar to the thrill of a nature watcher observing a fierce wild animal which thinks it is alone.